Hello, welcome to this webcast on crisis management planning. Crisis management is crucial to prevent or avert catastrophes and minimise the damage from any unavoidable situations. And this allows you to get your education care service back to normal as quickly as possible. Education and care services nationally have recently struggled with the many unexpected events of late, especially that of the global pandemic, bushfires and other natural disasters, which have driven home the importance of being prepared. This webcast has been proudly funded by Lottery West under its risk management initiative, seeing that a lot can be done to reduce impact on education and care services. So Child Australia has produced these webcasts, of which there are 3, to support not-for-profit services. Child Australia is a not-for-profit organisation itself, providing quality initiatives and services to professionals, parents and children. Our services range from professional development and online learning tools to programs for parents and early learning care for children. We are an organisation dedicated to improving developmental outcomes for all children. My name's Hans.
My name is Sarah and I'll be one of your webcast presenters for today's session. There is a set of resources that accompany this webcast, which you can find underneath this recording in the section titled Resources. Before we get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we are recording this session on, the land of the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging.
This webcast has been designed to assist preparedness for handling unplanned incidents. We need to rethink our plans for these events to ensure all stakeholders are considered. This reduces the risk to the service's continuance and ultimately keeping children, families, staff and all stakeholders safe. This webcast will help those working in not-for-profit services in their knowledge and awareness of crisis management planning. So we'll cover how to adopt a crisis management model by showing you how to initiate a crisis management review. We'll also discuss how to gain commitment from stakeholders and commence the plans that are required using an overriding crisis management plan approach. We'll also look at communications plans as well as an overall risk assessment approach, which is critical to identifying the priorities of what plans need to be prepared or how to rank unplanned incidents in priority. A community not-for-profit children's service usually has INC in their name, indicating it is incorporated. This means the service has its own legal identity, just like a human does. As a legal entity, it will have its own bank account, office equipment, staff, contracts with services like internet, phone, or even leasing of a building. This term, legal entity, also means that the service or the association needs to comply with laws and itself can be sued. The service, known as an association, has its thinking and decisions performed by a management committee. The difference between a for-profit or a privately owned service is that the profits are handled differently. An association is covered by the Associations Incorporation Act of 2015 and regulated by the Department of Mines, Industry, Regulation and Safety. Associations are operated as not-for-profit, meaning that any profit made is actually reinvested into the service for the benefits of its members, which in education and care is usually the children and the families. Different parts of the association's operation may also be regulated by other departments or laws. An example of this is the laws of taxation, which are governed by the Australian Taxation Office. Also, we have work health safety or discrimination laws. Education and care services such as early learning services, outside school hours care, and family daycare also have industry-specific laws and standards. For education and care, known commonly as childcare, are bound to national laws and regulations.
The term governance describes the structures and processes for decision-making, accountability, control and behaviour. This is a key feature of not-for-profit services, as privately owned services have decisions made by their owner or the owners. and any profits are channeled back to the owner. However, within a not-for-profit, the decisions are made by a group of members, voted in by other members at an annual general meeting, and they're typically called the Management Committee, the Governing Council, or a similar name. Committee members need to be aware that they have a legal duty in their roles under the Act and the Association's rules. This organisation chart shows a typical structure of a not-for-profit association, with office bearers, sometimes called the executives, in dark blue, with a chairperson, treasurer and secretary, with designated roles outlined in the Act. In light blue are the general committee members, who can also be part of subcommittees. Subcommittees are members tasked with portfolios of responsibilities such as finance and the audits, fundraising, or risk, which helps to divide the work of the committee. Governance takes planning and accountability. In the case of associations, this is the role of the committee members to meet the common goals.
The Management Committee is responsible for achieving the goals and objectives of the association. And the best way to achieve this is, as a committee, is to have a results-based framework like that shown on this slide. An overall continuing cycle of planning, monitoring and evaluation requires the skills of all those on the committee, which is further enriched by including the perspectives of stakeholders in the children's services. The stakeholders could be children, families, staff, the association members, but also others in the community that have an interest. An association's committee should expect that all members of the committee are participative in regular meetings, contributing to the use of their variety of skills, talents, experience and perspectives of all those that are on the committee. Once the services goals are set, the committee should look at how it is to monitor the performance of the service. An example of this could be reports presented by the services director or coordinator. The actions are then agreed at regular meetings by the committee, with further follow-up and decisions to be made. A results-based framework led by the chairperson with the committee ensures that quality improvement occurs, continues, and the service grows strategically.
Every business that involves members of the public raises a large assortment of harms and hazards. It is the role of the committee to oversee the reduction of harm and provide contingencies so your education and care service continues to operate. Infection control has been one of the strategies, which is now a regular feature of all businesses, thanks to the risks associated with COVID-19. However, in an education and care service, there are many other risks, such as work health and safety, care of young children, and with so many people involved, not-for-profit services must ensure that risks are identified early with supporting policies, procedures, checklists, monitoring of current practices are in place, and to ensure that we reduce the risk to children, families and community at all times. As an approved provider, the Not-for-Profit Association and its committee must ensure they comply with the duty of care and legislation to ensure all stakeholders remain safe.
In business, crisis management overlaps with that of risk management, in that organisations use both to consider what could go wrong and how best to address it. There's 5 steps to a crisis management planning. So throughout the planning of a framework, you're required to constantly assess the risk to the organisation as well as others as to the unexpected events. Risk management focuses on how to prevent the crises, while crisis management emphasises how to react. We need to understand how to measure the severity of a risk by first looking at the probability of that risk happening, and then look at the impact that risk may have. This assessment of risk can be applied in a number of other circumstances, but you also apply this approach to risks of an educational activity. For instance, a risk assessment can be used and made for an excursion of a group of children to the beach, which would find risks in the transport methods being used, the risks of being in public spaces, but also the risks to health and safety of children. Some services may feel the actual impact of a risk could be severe and not go ahead with the excursion.
Risks can be controlled in several ways. Using this model of the hierarchy of controls is to thoroughly address risks using a strategy from least effective to most effective. The same thinking is used by education and care services to assess the risks and identify controls needed in activities of a service. For example, an excursion, taking children off-site, ensuring that all risks are planned and managed. Looking at the model, we find that elimination of the hazard is the most effective, but not all hazards are able to be eliminated. For instance, the pandemic causes a risk from those with the virus. However, we now know anyone could be carrying the virus. Across the world, PPE is known as a strategy to avoid infection. We also now have more people practicing hand hygiene and the supply of hand sanitisers, which in the model are administrative controls. Furthermore, many are told to remain at home if feeling unwell, which is an engineering control. This tool has 5 levels, with the most effective being elimination. Remove the hazard altogether, followed by substitution, replacing the hazard with something less dangerous. Engineering control, redesign equipment or use guards or other equipment in isolation. Administrative controls are your policies and procedures, including training, supervision, and lastly, personal protective equipment. In some larger organisations, a risk committee is formed to monitor, evaluate, and plan for risks, which in smaller organisations, it may be the role of a dedicated risk manager. Either way, hazards must be identified and controlled to ensure safety of all stakeholders. We will shortly follow through a risk assessment template that assists in breaking down the risks of an event or an activity. The outcome is a plan, and the plan is to mitigate risks by thinking about the ways that harm can be reduced by using some level of control.
And here's a risk assessment and management tool, and this is provided by Sequa. You can find a copy of it in the resources section of this webcast down below. The tool is suitable for all different settings, and what it does here is it provides quite a lot of detail in terms of how to identify and assess and manage risks of harm in terms of excursions, but also in learning activities. So here's the contents there, and we're just going to go straight to how to complete a risk assessment. As you can see, there's some further details for those wanting to get further into risk assessment. We're going to the zoo, and this template here for the excursion, we've pre-filled in with some data with the pickup location and destination of where we're going. There's a space for the route that we're going to take on road by coach. And then in blue text, you can see there we've listed the educators' names, what their qualifications are, and the possibility of having some parents maybe help along, so parents of children as volunteers. So the idea here is on an excursion going step by step through this. We're looking at the additional need child that we have some funding for. They're going to provide an extra educator for making sure that he may attend. There's 12 children on the actual excursion, which means a ratio of 1 to 3. It then describes, asks us this template to describe the process for entering and exiting the service premises, but also the locations we're visiting. So we outline that, and then it guides you here. Here's an example of how we're going to make sure that all the children are on board the bus at the right time, and a process for checking with the driver to ensure that he doesn't leave until we give him the say-so. Also provided in this guide is a checklist for the excursion. And then finally on the right there, you'll see we're looking at the activities, so the bus route, the visiting of animals, and lunch, for example. We've actually sat down with the team and looked at the bus route, and using the risk matrix on the bottom left there, We've looked at the likelihood of having an accident, and we've thought it's possible that that could happen. But in terms of the consequences, we see that as it could be quite significant, if not high. So major. So that gives us an outcome of high on our risk matrix. So the idea is to use this risk matrix for each activity. If we think about crisis management, we can think about certain areas of crises readiness and use the same approach. Is it likely for that event to happen? And if so, how likely and what are the consequences? So we also reviewed looking at the circumstances of having a lunch, and with the lunch, we don't know what the ingredients are if we buy those. So the team was actually suggested that maybe it's a better idea that we bring our own food from the service, again, using the risk matrix. You'll also see a space where you can sign off, and this document then provides records for all educators and adults on that excursion and is records in administration for authorised officers to check.
Policies and procedures are the written guides of an organisation that explain how tasks are performed and agreed at any level. Policies and procedures can exist for almost anything, and a good starting point for any evaluation of an organisation's preparedness for crisis management is to review what policies and procedures are actually in place and agreed. This is really important in education and care, where there are numerous tasks with the added complexity of taking care of young children. So if there's no agreed approach to take for educators, then anything could actually happen and opens up more risk to the organisation and the service.
The minimum policies required under the education and care legislation are available publicly, though a more extensive explanation of what should be included can be found in the Guide to the National Quality Framework, available via the ASEQA website. This is a list of the mandated policies that must be in place as per the regulations. However, there are many more tasks found in the operation of an education and care service. This is a list of policies specifically required for those operating a family daycare. There are a number of procedures that are necessary for any organisation. In the additional resources section of this webcast, you will find a list of policies and procedures similar to the one on screen, which is helpful to identify further situations that may require a written policy document. We would suggest that you use the risk assessment tool previously covered as the basis for thinking. And when selecting where to start or to review of the crisis management planning tool, as these would be referenced information in any crisis management planning. Child Australia also provides a webcast on how to develop policies and procedures within the early childhood education and care sector. This webcast goes into further detail for developing best practice policy processes. Policies and procedures are the way the organisation documents its agreed methods and approaches, and they should always be regularly updated and reviewed.
Crisis management is the process of preparing for, managing and limiting the damage from unexpected negative events of an organisation or service. This means anticipating the threats, developing strategies to minimise harm, and implementing these strategies when a crisis occurs. A crisis poses some kind of threat to a service. It includes some element of surprise. It requires action to change the course of events and demands fast decision making. For example, a large hailstorm that floods the centre building during operations. There will need to be decisions made on how to keep children safe, how to move children to safer areas of the buildings. You might even have to consider the impact of power and electricity around water, and also how you're going to notify parents. Emergencies can occur suddenly when an event happens that's beyond the organisation's control, like that of an earthquake. A crisis can also develop over time as a small problem worsens because the organisation does not see or fails to act on the early warning signs. As an organisation, crisis is a low probability, high impact event that threatens the ongoing viability of the association. It is characterised by ambiguity of the cause, the effect and means of resolution, so the unknowns, and as well as by a belief that decisions must be made fast. The difficult part is that people generally don't put a lot of time into plan for surprise events or those that are of low probability. And usually the thinking is, why plan for something bad if it's not going to occur often? And many managers ask that same question until they've experienced a big crisis. As Timothy Coombs states, a crisis is the perception of an unpredictable event that threatens important expectancies of stakeholders and can seriously impact an organisation's performance and generate negative outcomes.
To assist with crisis management approaches in your not-for-profit service, you can use this framework to guide you. You would start by reviewing your service's current policies and procedures, as well as the external environment. For instance, if you're a regionally based service operated in a remote area, staffing and supply crises are important to consider. Reviewing the service's policies will help you to identify weaknesses and to give you some idea of how vulnerable your service may be. Education and care is influenced by a large number of factors. Think about what impacts would occur if your CCS system was corrupted. It is important, but it's not necessarily life-threatening, yet can still be the source of a major crisis. Think about if a child leaves the service unattended, what could happen? This is the thinking we need to plan for, and it will be covered in the remaining steps of the crisis management planning.
The second step of the crisis management planning process is to understand the impact of crises which have been already mentioned. And the practical way to do this is to use a SWOT analysis like the one on your screen. This is a simple way to summarise your service priorities by looking at external and internal matters, but also whether these priorities are helpful or harmful. For example, internally, if we were to look at the committee's skills in handling a crisis, which is internal, are the skills that we have on our committee more helpful or harmful? If helpful, we would call upon these strengths from the committee.
How vulnerable is your local education and care service? At times, there's unfortunately news and social media reports around incidences and/or complaints relating to education and care services. And education and care services are highly vulnerable to these external factors, particularly with reputational risks. Will a change in government or policy have an effect on your service? Just like the change in CCS payments during the initial COVID lockdowns. You've probably come up with a list of crises. We have also developed a list of other common crises for you to review in the attached resource pack of this webcast.
Step 3 in planning is about response and contingency planning. It prepares your service and staff to deal with the practical aspects of an actual crisis. So in your crisis management planning, this step is likely to be the most significant piece of work. Best practice developed plans require participation of as many stakeholders as possible. The most effective approach to creating or updating any policies or plans is to include all the staff that will be implementing and affected by the plan, especially as the primary contact for children and families in your service. Your staff's involvement in planning will promote some sense of ownership, less dissatisfaction and greater commitment to its implementation. Though it might not be possible to have the whole team involved, at a minimum, all the current staff members should sign off on the final document to ensure their awareness, understanding and compliance with the content. If we think about the management or the management committee, active leadership is crucial to the development of policies and procedures. So they will need to develop a policy review schedule that helps to ensure that all policies are regularly reviewed and consistently updated. Coordinators or directors, as well as committees, can allocate staff to develop, review, and comment on plans. Consulting with other coordinators and directors in an education and care service may also be helpful to broaden your thinking. There are 2 templates included in the resources section of this webcast: a crisis management plan and a crisis management action plan. Now, the action plan actually focuses on the sequence of steps in your service's response and recovery to a crisis. The crisis management plan, the overriding document, is a comprehensive framework document that sets out the policy of crisis management. So another way to think about it is the action plan is the procedure and the plan is the policy of crisis management. You can also develop a crisis management action plan in a stripped-down version of your crisis management plan. Now, a crisis management plan is comprehensive. An action plan is a quick start guide. So for this reason, an action plan can serve as a highly effective tool during the heat of a crisis by quickly letting anyone know what they should do next. So use the crisis management action plan template to record key contact information, procedures for responding, and also how to restore your services. First, determine how your service should respond to the crises you've identified as both probable and potentially having the greatest negative impact. But as with life, rarely does a crisis unfold exactly the way you planned. So your base plan should be informed by an all hazards approach, meaning that it should be adaptable to a wide variety of circumstances. A good way to achieve this is to think of your response actions as modules or elements that you can add when necessary. For instance, these actions could include closing the service premises, calling emergency services, issuing a public statement, reviewing relevant legal issues, evacuating a service, communicating with regulators, getting an emergency line of credit with your bank, offering counselling, taking security measures, or notifying staff, committee and families, or even turning off utilities. Then match the most likely risk scenarios with the necessary response elements. For example, the closure of the service due to a child reporting a positive COVID-19 test. You would need to enlist the elements of shutting down the service. You'll also need to issue a holding statement. You have to notify staff, families and close contacts. You also need to communicate with regulators, as well as reviewing the relevant government health advice. These elements could be used in other risk scenarios.
The next most important plan for an education and care service is a crisis communications plan. It is a series of steps that your service can follow in the case of an emergency or an other unexpected event. It details the messaging and statements you'll be using, how you will be communicating and responding to the public, and when applicable, the steps you'll take to ensure the crisis doesn't happen again. In the communications plan, it is important to identify the many audiences for the communication. For example, employees, families, any neighbouring services, the regulatory authority, external suppliers, key stakeholders, and anyone else associated with the service who should be made aware of the crisis. Establishing these plans ahead of time will ensure all communication is clear, informative, and shared in a timely manner. Reviewing your crisis communication plan allows you to reflect on your crisis management effectiveness. It is important to list this as an action within your quality improvement plan. Although different crises may trigger the implementation of the plan, a communications plan's general use remains the same. It's to ensure that everyone has access to current and correct information at the same time. Once a communication plan goes into effect, you are also able to more easily monitor any media coverage and ensure the public receives the correct information, hopefully reducing the impact. by nominating people to make up a communications plan, which should ideally be the chairperson or CEO or any legal advisors that could take the lead. This will allow the staff team to focus on the development of procedures outlined in the Crisis Management Action Plan. Of course, depending on how much external interest is happening around the situation, there may be other people who will need to respond. Make sure everyone has clearly been briefed on what they have to say. There's nothing worse than having a member of your team accidentally giving the false information simply because they didn't know. It is wise to have prepared statement samples ready for use to make the task more efficient and concise.
Once you've fully developed the crisis management plan, shift your focus to ensuring that all your team members and all staff know exactly what to do how to perform. You should also coordinate with other stakeholders that may be affected by the crises, that may be outside your service. In addition, be sure to alert suppliers and contractors so they can support a practice run of your emergency responses. Provide all those on the crisis management team with the action plan. Print out some hard copies and distribute them at the designated command location that's in your plan. Also, make sure that these plans, these action plans, are kept electronically so your employees can access it from their mobile devices or make additional copies very quickly. Now, after you introduce the plan, make sure to train everyone so that they're comfortable with their duties and with working together. You might want to look at performing a drill and a test on a regular basis, like that of once a quarter maybe. Just like the approach that many use in services to do evacuation drills, to perform, to meet the education and care law. A good idea is to use these evacuation drills to test out your crisis management plan. For instance, what happens if you cannot return to the service? What if the evacuation assembly area is not accessible? You could also enact a test run of your communications plan at the same time. Provide your staff team with the information that is relevant to their respective positions. For example, disseminate or share the protocol for closing down the service and for resuming the service after a mandated pandemic lockdown. There are now even more likely to happen and provide another opportunity to refine crisis management approaches.
This set of rules can help you guide others in training for a crisis event. We would like to highlight overall rules to abide by to make your crisis management journey less stressful. Most importantly is committing to an ongoing process for crisis readiness. This webcast is one of those ways to help you get prepared. Stay calm as possible and prioritise people over property. Communicate clearly, appointing only one credible spokesperson. Finally, ensure you plan for opportunity to review and reflect following any crisis event.
In order to keep your crisis management plan current, make sure to schedule a regular review of its contents. When updating your plan, make sure to incorporate any relevant or recent changes to your service or any changes that may be relevant from legislation. Keeping subscribed to key sector organisations can assist currency. Consider changes in your processes, the changes in suppliers, changes in the building, and even the staff when you're making these updates. Crisis management experts recommend reviewing your plan at least once a year. If you have a crisis, make sure to do a review of your response and how you went, and incorporate the lessons on strengths and weaknesses into your plan for future use. Draw up a schedule to revisit policies in a service diary or calendar. The committee should document this and ensure that the manager is completing the reviews as scheduled, and make sure what is documented actually reflects the understood processes and approach currently in practice. The process of review and updating within a document is referred to as document control. Document version control helps the reader see the historical records of how the document has been updated over time. You'll come across it in other areas of work, seeing tables and documents with meticulous logs of what's been changed and what version is the current version. But version control is really important because then you know everyone's working from the same version of a document and you know they've got the latest version. So this process is important because it keeps an audit trail of how the file was changed, who saw the changes through, and whether they've been approved and when it all happened. And the easiest way to version control your documents is to have your software tools do it for you. The Office Suite has these features built in, but a simple way is to include within a document a table like that on your screen. For further ways to develop policies and procedures, consider the Child Australia Webcast Developing Policies and Procedures, which is available through our website.
This webcast was part of the Effective Governance for Education and Care Services, brought to you by Child Australia and funded by Lottery Rest under its Risk Management Initiative. We looked at today the results-based framework to look at the model of how you conduct your committee. We touched on how to risk assess and looking at the actual crisis management planning steps, which were 5. The first step was to look at the fit of the organisation for crisis management planning. That required an analysis, a risk assessment of the policies and procedures that are in place to identify areas that we need to concentrate on to plan for. We looked at step 2, the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities and threats of the SWOT analysis. And that was looking at the skills of our organisation, skills of people in our service as to how best we can plan for crises. Step 3 was the responses to a crisis. And part of that was the plan itself, but also within that plan, a communications plan that tells people how to communicate and what to communicate, but it was also a plan, an action plan for staff during a crisis for step-by-step procedures on what and how to do things. The 4th stage of crisis management planning was that of training and implementation, making sure that you test the actual policy procedure, the processes and the plan of crisis management. And then lastly was looking at reviewing those processes. So reviewing the crisis management planning that's been put in place and testing those out. A hint, linking that to the emergency evacuation procedures of many services. Thanks for joining us on this webcast. Please check out the Child Australia website for other content in the Effective Governance for Education and Care Services. We hope to see you next time.